The Diary of Anne Frank by Frances Goodrich and Albert Hackett. Act 1, Scene 2, second half. During the following scene, Mr. Frank helps Margot and Mrs. Frank to hang up their clothes. Then he persuades them both to lie down and rest. The Van Dans in their room above settle themselves. In the main room, Anne and Peter remove their shoes. Peter takes his cat out of the carrier. Anne, what's your cat's name? Peter, Mooshy. Anne, Mooshy, Mooshy, Mooshy. She picks up the cat, walking away with it. To Peter, I love cats. I have one, a darling little cat, but they made me leave her behind. I left some food and a note for the neighbors to take care of her. I'm going to miss her terribly. What is yours, a him or a her? Peter, he's a Tom. He doesn't like strangers. He takes the cat from her, putting it back in its carrier. Anne, unabashed. Then I'll have to stop being a stranger, won't I? Where did you go to school? Peter, Jewish secondary. Anne, but that's where Margot and I go. I never saw you around. Peter, I used to see you, sometimes. Anne, you did? Peter, in the schoolyard. You were always in the middle of a bunch of kids. He takes a penknife from his pocket. Anne, why didn't you ever come over? Peter, I'm sort of a lone wolf. He starts to rip off his Star of David. Anne, what are you doing? Peter, taking it off. Anne, but you can't do that. They'll arrest you if you go out without your star. He tosses his knife on the table. Peter, who's going out? Anne, why, of course you're right. Of course we don't need them anymore. She picks up his knife and starts to take her star off. I wonder what our friends will think when we don't show up today. Peter, I didn't have any dates with anyone. Anne, oh, I did. I had a date with Joppy to go and play ping pong at her house. Do you know Joppy DeWall? Peter, no. Anne, Joppy's my best friend. I wonder what she'll think when she telephones and there's no answer. Probably she'll go over to the house. I wonder what she'll think. We left everything as if we'd suddenly been called away. Breakfast dishes in the sink, beds not made. As she pulls off her star, the cloth underneath shows clearly the color and form of the star. Look, it's still there. Peter goes over to the stove with his star. What are you going to do with yours? Peter, burn it. Anne, she starts to throw hers in and cannot. It's funny. I can't throw mine away. I don't know why. Peter, you can't throw something they branded you with? That they made you wear so they could spit on you? Anne, I know, but after all, it is the Star of David, isn't it? In the bedroom right, Margot and Mrs. Frank are lying down. Mr. Frank starts quietly out. Peter, maybe it's different for a girl. Mr. Frank comes into the main room. Mr. Frank, forgive me, Peter. Now let me see, we must find a bed for your cat. He goes to a cupboard. I'm glad you brought your cat. Anne was feeling so badly about hers. Getting a used small wash tub. Here we are. Will it be comfortable in that? Peter, gathering up his things. Thanks. Mr. Frank, opening the door of the room on the left. And here's your room. But I warn you, Peter, you can't grow any more, not an inch, or you'll have to sleep with your feet out of the skylight. Are you hungry? Peter, no. Mr. Frank, we have some bread and butter. Peter, no, thank you. Mr. Frank, you can have it for luncheon then. And tonight we will have a real supper, our first supper together. Peter, thanks. He goes into his room. During the following scene, he arranges his possessions in his new room. Mr. Frank, that's a nice boy, Peter. Anne, he's awfully shy, isn't he? Mr. Frank, you'll like him, I know. Anne, I certainly hope so, since he's the only boy I'm likely to see for months and months. Mr. Frank sits down, taking off his shoes. Mr. Frank, Annalay, there's a box there. Will you open it? He indicates a carton on the couch. Anne brings it to the center table. In the street below, there is a sound of children playing. Anne, as she opens the carton. You know the way I'm going to think of it here? I'm going to think of it as a boarding house. A very peculiar summer boarding house, like the one that she breaks off as she pulls out some photographs. Father, my movie stars! I was wondering where they were. I was looking for them this morning. And Queen Wilhelmina, how wonderful! Mr. Frank said, There's something more. Go on, look further. He goes over to the sink, pouring a glass of milk from a thermos bottle. Anne, pulling out a pasteboard-bound book. A diary! She throws her arms around her father. I've never had a diary, and I've always longed for one. She looks around the room. Pencil, pencil, pencil. She starts down for the stairs. I'm going down to the office to get a pencil. Mr. Frank, Anne, no! He goes after her, catching her by the arm and pulling her back. Anne, startled. But there's no one in the building now. Mr. Frank, it doesn't matter. I don't want you ever to go beyond that door. Anne, sobered, never? Not even at night time when everyone is gone or on Sundays? Can't I go down to listen to the radio? Mr. Frank, never. I am sorry, Annika. It isn't safe. No, you must never go beyond that door. For the first time, Anne realizes what going into hiding means. Anne, I see. Mr. Frank, it'll be hard, I know. But always remember this, Annika. There are no walls, there are no bolts, no locks that anyone can put on your mind. Meep will bring us books. We will read history, poetry, mythology. He gives her the glass of milk. Here's your milk. With his arm about her, they go over to the couch, sitting down side by side. As a matter of fact, between us, Anne, being here has certain advantages for you. For instance, you remember the battle you had with your mother the other day on the subject of overshoes? You said you'd rather die than wear overshoes? But in the end, you had to wear them? Well, now you see, for as long as we are here, you will never have to wear overshoes. Isn't that good? And the coat that you inherited from Margot, you won't have to wear that anymore. And the piano, you won't have to practice on the piano. I tell you, this is going to be a fine life for you. Anne's panic is gone. Peter appears in the doorway of his room with a saucer in his hand. He is carrying his cat. Peter, I thought I'd better get some water for Mushi before... Mr. Frank, of course. As he starts toward the sink, the carrion begins to chime the hour of 8. He tiptoes to the window at the back and looks down at the street below. He turns to Peter, indicating in pantomime that it is too late. Peter starts back for his room. He steps on a creaking board. The three of them are frozen for a minute in fear. As Peter starts away again, Anne tiptoes over to him and pours some of the milk from her glass into the saucer for the cat. Peter squats on the floor, putting the milk before the cat. Mr. Frank gives Anne his fountain pen and then goes into the room at the right. For a second, Anne watches the cat. Then she goes over to the center table and opens her diary. In the room at the right, Mrs. Frank has sat up quickly at the sound of the carrion. Mr. Frank comes in and sits down beside her on the settee, his arm comfortingly around her. Upstairs in the attic room, Mr. and Mrs. Van Dam have hung up their clothes in the closet and are now seated on the iron bed. Mrs. Van Dam leans back exhausted. Mr. Van Dam fans her with a newspaper. Anne starts to write in her diary. The lights dim out, the curtain falls. In the darkness, Anne's voice comes to us again, faintly at first, and then with growing strength. Anne's voice. I expect I should be describing what it feels like to go into hiding, but I really don't know yet myself. I only know it's funny never to be able to go outdoors, never to breathe fresh air, never to run and shout and jump. It's the silence in the night that frightens me most. Every time I hear a creak in the house or a step on the street outside, I'm sure they're coming for us. The days aren't so bad. At least we know that Meep and Mr. Crawler are down there below us in the office. Our protectors, we call them. I asked Father what would happen to them if the Nazis found out they were hiding us. Pim said that they would suffer the same fate that we would. Imagine, they know this, and yet when they come up here, they're always cheerful and gay as if there were nothing in the world to bother them. Friday, the 21st of August, 1942. Today I'm going to tell you our general news. Mother is unbearable. She insists on treating me like a baby, which I loathe. Otherwise, things are going better. The weather is. As Anne's voice is fading out, the curtain rises on the scene.